holy word. Just we ask in your name. Amen.
Amen. Good morning.
Good morning.
My dad tells the story of back when he lived in Mexico. They had a herdsman, and everybody had sheep or cattle or whatever they had. I think it was cattle in that case, so their herdsman would take all the cattle in the morning. Each farmer, I guess, would bring the cattle to the road, and this guy would drive them out to the mountains, and he would watch over them for the day while they were out there grazing. So one day, for some reason, several farmers kept their cows back, and he only had a small herd of cattle. And so the herdsman brought the cattle back at noon. And when questioned about that, he said, well, you're supposed to be grazing them all day. And he said, well, yeah, there's smaller herds, so it doesn't take as long. So I guess we can make a shorter message out of it, or I don't know if there's any lesson in it for us this morning. All right. Let me get this to full screen so I can see this. All right. So this morning the message is, I titled it Instruction Manuals and the Big Picture. So we don't have a lot of these IKEA stores around here, but who knows what that is? It's a furniture store where you assemble it yourself. I don't like assembling stuff. I don't mind it so much, but instruction books drive me crazy. I don't like instruction manuals. And but if you're one of those people who loves doing that, then bless your heart. I just don't. So anyway, I find, I have a keen dislike for long-winded instruction manuals. And a lot of times I was like, this thing could be condensed with like 5 steps instead of 35, but they're not that way. So anyway, if I buy an item that needs a lot of assembly, I like to have a nice picture of what the finished product is supposed to look like. And I like to study that, and then I'll take out the parts and look at them, and then look at the instruction manual, and then I can usually figure it out with fairly easily. But if I just look at the instruction manual without seeing the picture of what it's supposed to be, or if I just scatter the parts out and don't see the big picture, it's confusing to me, and I will have a very long day of that, and I don't enjoy that. So I'm going to use an analogy of that type of thing in this message. And so, as all analogies go, they fall apart at some point. So bear with me here. Just take the lesson out of it and just leave the rest of it if it does not get too hung up on the ideas. But let's try to see. The idea is to try to see the big picture of something, to see what the end result is supposed to be. And when it's all boiled down, what is it supposed to be? And we're going to apply this to our Christian life. So imagine that you are at an auction. And I like to go to auctions, so I'm going to use this. Imagine you're at an auction and there's this box. Somebody has brought, it's consignment sale, somebody has brought a box out there to the auction. It's maybe 6 feet long, about 2 feet wide, and about 6 inches tall. And it's at the auction. It's a cardboard box. It's kind of weather-beaten looking. And all the pictures, any writing on it has long since worn off from the weather, and so nobody knows what's in this box. And the guy who brought it there on consignment, he has just dropped it off, and he hasn't. Well, he mentioned to the auctioneer what this thing was, but he too has forgotten what this thing was supposed to be. It's supposed to serve some purpose, this box or whatever was in it, but nobody really knows what this thing is supposed to be. The picture isn't on it anymore. So speculation among the auction goers kind of runs wild, and everybody has opinions on what this thing might be. And somebody starts the rumor. He says he hears that what's in this box is supposed to protect your trash cans from coons and possums and other varmints. And so some people agree that kind of makes sense. This box weighs about 300 pounds, but you could take this thing and set it on top of your trash cans, and it would keep those critters out. So that kind of makes sense, but it does seem a little bit senseless that somebody would use something like that to keep their varmints out. But some people run with that, and they say, okay, so it's to keep coons and critters out. So, and somebody has heard that whatever's in this box is supposed to keep your lawnmower from the elements. It's supposed to protect your lawnmower from the elements. And others like, yeah, no, not that. Because there is no way a 6 foot by 2 foot something is going to protect your lawnmower from the elements. It's not possible. And so there's some arguing going on about that. And then somebody else brings it up, and he kind of gets laughed at a little bit. But somebody else brings up an entirely different angle. He says, this box will protect your valuables from would-be thieves, and it keeps them from gaining access to your stuff. And he gets laughed out, and the auctioneer, he kicks him out of the auction. He's like, okay, you bring up ridiculous theories like that, you're no longer welcome to come to our auction here, because that's obviously ridiculous. This box is not going to do that. And so finally the son of the seller comes along, and he says, hey, I know what's in this box. Dad told me. Inside this box there's an instruction manual, and there's a whole bunch of parts, and when you put all that together, it's going to make a storage building. You remember that storage building we helped load the other year? You're probably following this array. It's going to make a storage building. And the auction goer is like, okay, there's no way this thing is going to be a storage building. And you don't know that because there's nothing written on the box. And so you don't know that. And so upon the auctioneer's bidding, they stone the guy and kill him, because that kind of foolishness cannot be handled. And so but it gets sold, and so now let's imagine that you're the one who ended up with this box. And so when you, apart from speculation, you don't know what's in it. And so you take the box home and you open it up, and inside there are over 600 parts in this box. And even though there's an instruction manual in there, it is still frustrating to you because you have no idea what the end result's supposed to look like. You really don't know. You just see this whole list of instructions, but you don't really know what the end result's supposed to look like. So without a picture of what the end result's supposed to be, it may, even though you follow the instructions as best you can, it may still not end up looking like what it was intended to be. You may end up with a door up against the fence, or it may end up on end or on its roof. It could end up any which way because you don't have an idea what this thing's supposed to be like. Okay, so now let's apply the storage building analogy to how many people over the years have tried to follow God. So over the years, we see again and again how people have failed to see the big picture. And so they have memorized the instruction manual, the Bible, but they have never started building. They memorize it, they got all this knowledge, but they never start building. And so they're confused as to why their lawnmower is still getting wet. But they've never started building, but they know all the stuff. And so, or maybe, like I said earlier, maybe in their ignorance, they built it upside down, or they built it, the door on the wrong side to where it's completely useless. And so maybe after they've started building for a few hours, they know they're on the right track. Somebody told them this thing is going to keep your lawnmower from getting wet. And so you've worked for a couple of hours, and all of a sudden a big rainstorm hits. And you find it frustrating because your lawnmower is still getting wet. And you have no idea why it's still getting wet, because you've already worked on this thing for a few hours and it's still not working right. And so you might at that point just scrap the whole thing, throw the whole thing in the dumpster. That's how it often works in people when they start following Christ. They give up too soon. They give up after the first temptation hits them. They're like, okay, this is not supposed to happen. We're not supposed to be tempted, right? When we're following God, we're God's children. We're not supposed to be tempted like this anymore. And I still fell. I still sinned. And so why is this? I followed the instruction manual. It's, and that's the point where some people just get so, they give up. They give up following Christ because of a few mishaps like that. So anyway, when reading the Bible, reading God's instruction manual for us, I have often I'll admit it, I've gotten frustrated. I don't know if any of, I'm sure some of you can relate to this. Gotten frustrated with all the requirements that God put on His people, especially in the Old Testament. And it can be a little overwhelming when you're reading through the Old Testament. There's 613 laws that God has given His people to follow. And they cover everything from moral to civil to ceremonial requirements. And all these laws, they can be so confusing. And I'm a simple guy. I find this kind of thing confusing. Like, God, show me the big picture. Show me what it's supposed to look like. The end result is supposed to look like. And then these other things might fall in place. But just seeing these instructions, it's just not really working out for me. And so let's look at how God's people over the years have sometimes lost sight of the big picture. Even though they've had the big picture at one point, how they've sometimes lost sight of the big picture in their attempts to please God. And, well, sometimes they've even stopped attempting to please God, but they somehow want God's blessing on them, so they've tried to follow the instruction manual, not realizing what the big picture is. So in the Old Testament book of Micah, that's what I was reading this week, and that's where I'm going to base some of this message on. In the book of Micah, God's people have fallen far from God. They've strayed far from God. Israel is a nation at this point, but the people have strayed from God. They're breaking God's commandments. They're going after and worshiping the abominable gods of the nations around them. And so God is very displeased with them. And so, and then He sends Micah to warn these people. And he reprimands them for cheating others out of things that are rightfully theirs. That's another thing that they've fallen into. They've started cheating others of what was rightfully theirs. And in chapter 6, verse 11, Micah 6, verse 11, one thing that God especially hates is the use of dishonest scales, is what it says. And so Micah is prophesying of coming judgment against Israel and against Judah, which was two separate countries at the time. One was the northern kingdom, one was... Anyway, and so we'll catch up with him in chapter 6, verse 6. That's where we're going to start. And Micah starts by asking the question, how can we please God? Not in those words, but sort of in that line. How can we please God? What can we do to please God? So chapter 6, verse 6, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before Him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Okay, well, if we read or know the Old Testament, we know that is biblical, right? That was God's instruction. They're supposed to bow before God, and they were supposed to offer yearlings before God. That was something they were supposed to do. So that's kind of a rhetorical question there. Is this what I'm supposed to do? Shall I come before God? Shall I bow myself before God? Shall I make the sacrifice? Now, notice to bow down, to do the physical act of getting on your knees, or getting a year-old calf out of your herd of livestock and bringing it to an altar and killing it and burning it, there is no heart change required for that, right? There's nothing, like, it's just an outward thing. There's no heart change required for that. But that is still something that God instructed His people to do. God wanted His people to do that, but it was so much more. If people saw the big picture, they would get it. But here, they've strayed from God, and they're still going through all these ceremonial things. They're still bringing their animals every year. They have this huge celebration in Jerusalem, and they're sacrificing their animals and all these kinds of things. They're still doing these outward motions, but their heart is far from God. They've added all kinds of stuff to this. They've brought in the gods of the nations around them. They're even going and worshiping some of these gods. They're doing all kinds of things, and yet outwardly they're still going through the motions. And so, let's see. So Israel had essentially kept its instruction manual or law, but they strayed far from God. The problem was they had started using things that weren't included in the kit and added it to this thing, and all of a sudden it became some sort of a monstrosity, some kind of a Frankenstein version of what God had intended this thing to be. This beautiful thing that God had designed for them, it becomes something ugly because it's tainted by sinful people and sinful ways. So if too much emphasis is placed on following instructions instead of making sure that this building you're building is built the right way, right side up, it's not going to be useful, and you're not doing you're still not doing what God intended you to do. And there's no merit, no credit to your account for doing that. So in 1 Samuel, King Saul comes back. And here's an example of how Israel often misunderstood God's purpose in the commands that He gave them. In 1 Samuel, we have King Saul came back from and he had just won a huge victory in some military exercise or some military mission that he had gone on to some city, and God had instructed him to go into the city, and he's supposed to kill they're supposed to just obliterate everything, tear down all the buildings, kill all the people, kill all the animals. Like, there was supposed to be nothing alive in that city, and they're supposed to burn it all. Well, Saul comes back, and the greed inside of Saul didn't allow him to do that. And he killed every person except the king, who later on came and caused problems. But anyway, God had a plan in mind as to why He wanted them to destroy everything. But anyway, He also brought back a bunch of nice livestock. These people had great livestock. And He brought back a whole herd of cattle. And so he's over there, and and again, Saul he's following the law. He brings back these animals. He's just not following God's current instructions. And he's in verse 22 of 1 Samuel 15, the prophet Samuel catches up with Saul as Saul has just fired up his grill, there was altar up, and he's out there, and he's going to sacrifice some of this beautiful cattle that he has brought along from this city that he went and was supposed to have destroyed. And that's where Samuel catches him, and he said, Saul, did you do what you were supposed to do? Did you go and do this, destroy that? And Saul's like, oh yeah, I sure did, man. I killed everything. I killed everything. Well, except for the king. I did bring him along as a hostage, but everything else we killed. And then Samuel says, well, I hear cattle. Like, where'd that come from? Because we're not like back in Jerusalem or anything like that, where there's, where people have, we're still out here way out in the battle, close to the battlefield. So what's with the cattle? And Saul was like, oh, I saved the best livestock to sacrifice to God. Well, that was biblical, wasn't it? Sacrificing the best animals to God. See, where Saul screwed up was that sacrifice was supposed to have been made in the city that he destroyed. He was supposed to burn it all. That's where that sacrifice was supposed to be made. Not bring it along and burn it on an altar here, try to please God like that and act like that's not even a sacrifice. You're not supposed to have this thing in the first place, so you're not really sacrificing anything at all. It's like you going out and robbing a bank and tithing off of come on, man, you're not supposed to even have that. Anyway, Saul tries to explain himself over here, and Samuel says, has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. Saul had just missed the mark in a spectacular fashion here. I mean, totally missed the point of what God was wanting him to do here. And his greed led him to bring back the livestock, and it seems ridiculous, like I said, for him to think that he would please God by sacrificing the stolen goods. And so this is where we need to take some time to self-evaluate ourselves a little bit and to see, do we do the same thing? Are we ever guilty of the same thing? Maybe not exactly that way, but in sort of the same fashion in trying to please God with things that are and totally missing the big picture again. So Micah 6 verse 7, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Okay, let me tell you, God did not need Saul's cattle, nor does He need your money. God does not need your money. You give that because you are instructed to do that. You don't give it because God is needy and He can't make a way without your money. God will have His way whether or not you put your money in the offering box. It's going to be you who misses out on the blessing. And that works out that way every time. So let's be very sure that in our hearts that we know that, and that we don't think that we are doing anything extraordinary by, well, even when we do follow God, we're only doing what we're supposed to do, right? We're not gaining favor with God. We're just doing the things we're supposed to be doing. We're doing those things because we already have favor with God. And when you do give, if you want to give money to a poor person somewhere, whatever kind of thing you want to sacrifice, do it because you have compassion on that person, not because you have to. Or do it for the love of God. Do it because you love God. Because we have the love of God in our hearts, let's give freely. But not because we feel obligated to, or because we somehow feel that God couldn't get along without our sacrifices. Now we got to give. No, that's not how it works. We give because God first loved us and He gave the ultimate sacrifice for us. God still wants our sacrifices, but let's keep our priorities straight and keep this right. Why we do this. And so, if you ask people from a different denomination, so here's another thing, about losing sight of the big picture, if you ask people from different denominations, what is God all about? I was just trying to think who I talked with the other day, or was it some speaker that I was listening to? They had this heathen neighbor of some sort, or some pagan, I don't know what he was, and this couple is involved in ministry, and they had just gotten all excited about speaking in tongues and so forth, and so the neighbor man, he sees their excitement, and so one day he comes over there and he says, "Hey, I know you guys are involved in some kind of ministry, full-time ministry." He said, "What do you guys do, or what do you believe?" And the wife was right there, and the question was asked of the husband, and the wife was telling the story, and she says, "This was a lesson for me to, let my husband answer these things sometimes instead of me answering questions for him." But anyway, so he had asked, "So what do you guys believe?" And he's like, "Speaking tongues, we believe in tongues," is what she said. And this guy just looked at her like, he didn't know Jesus, didn't know the first thing about tongues, and now she's yapping about tongues. And she realized she had just messed up, and the guy just really was weirded out by this whole thing. But see, so you ask different people, what do you believe in? What's your version? What side? Just like these people at this auction. Okay, what is this thing supposed to be? All of them were correct. It protected your tools from getting stolen. It protected you could put your trash cans in there, keep the varmints out of there. You could put your lawnmower in there. The storage building analogy here. So, but people have the same idea when you ask them about their beliefs. They don't, hey, Jesus Christ and His righteousness, that's what we're after. That's what we believe in, following Jesus. And in several times in the Bible, it's just, Jesus gets asked this question. Micah answers this question in verse 8. We'll get to that yet. And what does all this boil down to, and what is the big picture here? What does God want to see from us? And so, but see, here are some of the things that people will tell you when you ask them, what do you believe? Some, we believe in speaking in tongues. Others will say, we believe it's water baptism, dunking, no sprinkling or anything. We believe in full submersion. That's what we believe. Yeah, we believe that. Others we believe in ladies got to wear long sleeves and skirts, and others will tell you we believe in healing the sick, and others will tell you different things like that. And so we're all looking at the same instruction manual, but all coming up with a different idea of what this thing is supposed to look like when it gets done. All these things are true, but they're not an accurate description of what the ultimate goal is. And so it reminds me of a children's play I read back in grade school. And so there's this a traveling peddler who's traveling and he's got this big sack of merchandise he's trying to sell, and he stops in the jungle beside a trail to rest a bit, and he takes the sack and he starts looking at his merchandise, and he has a saucepan. He finds a saucepan in there that he's planning to sell, but it has a hole in it, and so it renders it pretty much useless. And so he throws it beside the rock that he's been sitting on and takes up his bag and keeps traveling. And so a little bit later, a monkey comes up on the saucepan, and he starts looking at it and just studying it. And he's like, what does man use this particular object for? And he's looking at it, and a brightly colored bird lands on a branch on top of him, and he asks the monkey, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "I don't know what this is. Man dropped this thing over here. I don't know what this is." And the bird looks at it, and he's like, "Well, it's obvious it's a mirror. Man uses it when he combs his hair." And so So monkey looks into it. Sure enough, he sees his reflection, so he starts picking off ticks and mites and whatnot all, and preening himself in this mirror. And so eventually along comes a giraffe, and the giraffe is watching him with some amusement. And giraffe says, "Monkey, what are you doing?" And he says, "Oh, I'm using a mirror. Man dropped the mirror off, and I'm using it like man uses. I'm pretending I'm man, combing my hair." And giraffe says, "You silly monkey, that's not a mirror, that's a hat. It's obvious. Man puts it on his head and walks around and protects his head from the sun." Monkey's like, "Oh, that makes sense." And so he puts this thing on his head and walks off, pretending to be man walking through the jungle. And eventually he comes up to a river where he meets an antelope. And at the river, antelope says, "What's that funny thing you're wearing on your head, monkey?" And so monkey says, "Well, it's a hat. I'm pretending to be man walking through the jungle." And the antelope says, "Well, it's not a hat. It's a boat. It's obvious. You put it in the water, and man uses it to float across the river." And so monkey's like, "Okay, well, that's obvious. That's what it is." So he sets the saucepan in the river, and he sits down on it, and the thing immediately sinks and disappears with the stream because it had a hole in it, right? And so monkey is frantically searching for this boat, and along comes hippopotamus. And hippopotamus watches monkey with some disbelief, and he says, "What are you doing, monkey? What are you looking for?" And monkey says, "Well, I'm looking for my boat. Man dropped it off." And he explains how he came upon this thing, and so hippopotamus says, "Well, what did your boat look like?" And he said, "Well, it was about this big around, had a tail on it, kind of a thing, and it's real shiny and smooth and everything." Hippopotamus says, "Monkey, you silly thing, that was a fish. It wasn't any of those things that you'd been explaining. It's a fish, obviously. Fish have tails. Fish are round like that, and they're smooth and slippery and everything. Yep, it was a fish." And the giraffe, he stands there and he nods his head, and he's like, "Hippopotamus is old." And antelope says, "Hippopotamus is wise." And they all together say, "Of course it must have been a fish." And so that's how people look at their religion a lot of times, right? They get this weird idea about what this is, and they miss the big picture. They don't know. Of course, the monkey wouldn't have known what to do with the saucepan. He doesn't boil his food, right? So, but it's a useful thing, but we miss the big picture. So Micah 6 verse 8. Micah boils it down. He says, "This is what God wants. He has told you, O man," speaking of God, "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Brothers and sisters, this is the big picture. This is what God wants to see of us, not bickering about tongues or healing or anything. No, God wants to see us loving on others, to show mercy, to do justly. And we're not talking about exacting justice on people. No, walking justly in ourselves. And if your Christian life, our Christian lives aren't shaping up to resemble this, we're probably not putting it together right. It should resemble this. The completed project should resemble this. God has shown us and done us good. These are the requirements for us. These are to do justice. We need to be just and fair, no matter if we think the next person deserves it. Micah 6 verse 11 says, "Shall I acquit the man with the wicked scales and with a bag of deceitful weights?" See, these scales they had was a balance, and each side of the balance was supposed to weigh equally, and they maybe had a little tray or something suspended on the bottom of this balance. And so if you were a seller, you would have weights. Maybe a 1 pound weight and a 2 pound weight or whatever, if you're selling in ounces, whatever it was. And you would put your customer wanted to buy a pound of whatever, you would put your weight. You would have the weight, and he would trust you that your weights were accurate. You put a weight on there on the one side, and then maybe you were selling grain, you would pour grain on the other side till the scale was exactly balanced, and you would both know that you had now sold him a pound of wheat. And but the thing was, a lot of these people would mess with their weights, and they would make them lighter than what they were supposed to be, and that was an unfair scale. And so for some reason, God had a particular dislike for cheating others out of what was rightfully theirs. Maybe it's because it's so ingrained in the human nature to sometimes, in the human sinful nature, to do these kinds of things. But that's also why if you look at let's say you look at a quarter, it's got the ribs around the edge, right? You ever notice that? Because quarters used to be made out of silver. You know that? A quarter was a $quarter, and it was a quarter of the size of a silver dollar. So they put these ribs on the edge of it because there were people that would take a file. Kings used to do this with their gold coins, but they would take a file and they would file down all around this coin, and they would make it a little bit smaller, and they would keep these silver shavings. And if they did that to enough of them, they could make a lot of extra money that way. And so back then, of course, a quarter was worth a little more, but if it was still silver, it would still be worth a lot. So anyway, so that was to keep people from doing that kind of thing, because it is just something that people do who are willing to cheat others. They do this kind of thing. So, okay, the next one is, and to love mercy. So are we merciful people? Do we show mercy to others? God has shown us so much mercy. Are we willing to extend that mercy to others, even though we think they don't deserve it? Maybe we read the paper or something and some criminal has gotten off with a light sentence. Well, we would have loved if that happened to us, if we had been in his shoes, wouldn't we? Can we rejoice with him? I mean, I know that's really hard to do, but can we rejoice with him? Yesterday I was at the prison, and I was talking with some of these inmates, and sometimes it's very frustrating because some of these guys have been in prison. This is maybe their fifth go-round in prison. And we're like, you never learn. And now they come to me and they want me to help them straighten their lives out. And like, you're not even trying. And there's something in me that like, guy sits down across from me. I know this was one example yesterday. Guy, he had tattoos. He had his eyebrows. He had tattoos over each eyebrow with some words. I don't know what it all was. His face was all covered, and his neck and everything. And just at a glance, he looked like a hardcore dude. This was his fifth time in prison, where each time he'd been there quite a few years. I think this last time he got like 20 years or something, and he's 50 years old, and by now anyway, it was a sad story. But when he sat down across from me, first thing I saw was all those tattoos, but when he sat down across from me, his facial tattoos, usually that's taking it to another level. He was covered. Anyway, not that makes you a big sinner, but sometimes big sinners do that. And so he sat across from me, but when I looked into his face, I saw a light in his eyes. And I asked him for his story, and so I said, and I said, so how many times have you been incarcerated? How many times have you? Yeah. And he said, well, this is my fifth time. I said, well, is this your last time? He said, absolutely. I said, what are you doing different this time? What makes you think that this is going to be the last time? He said, this time I'm doing it with Jesus. I never did it with Jesus before, but this time I am. And he said, I know this is going to be the last time. And I could just see that. And I said, I believe you because I see that light in your eyes. And so we got to be able to look past somebody's rough exterior and be able to see him for the human being on whom God has mercy, the same as he has mercy on us. I just heard a guy telling a story about a patient who had come into a conversation he had overheard in an emergency room. I don't know if he had been on the administration at the hospital or something, but so this patient comes into the emergency room, and apparently this patient is a regular at the emergency room, and he keeps coming in there for some alcohol-related diseases that he has. And this time he's come in there because of he has symptoms that would later be diagnosed as inflammation of the pancreas due to excessive alcohol consumption. And so the head doctor working in the ER, he was a well respected in his facility, determined that hospitalization was warranted with this patient. And so he instructs the doctor who's on the next round, who's supposed to be replacing him there. He instructs that doctor, who happens to be a brilliant young lady. She's attended a prestigious medical school, and she's just beginning her postgraduate studies here at this hospital. And so she's going to be relieving him from his duties. So he instructs her to admit the man and into the hospital. And so she's a little frustrated by this, and she's already a bit sleep deprived and everything from her grueling schedule for studies and also working here already and stuff. And this was her fifth admission of the night, and so she feels it's unfair. She felt it was unfair that she had to now spend a lot of time caring for and treating a patient whose sickness or disease was obviously self-inflicted. And so she complains about it to the doctor. And the doctor's response was spoken very emphatically in almost a whisper. He says, you became a physician to care for people and to heal them. You didn't become a physician to judge them. If you don't understand the difference, you have no right to train at this institution. Anyway, she took that reprimand to heart, and she diligently took good care of that patient, and she went on to a stellar career in medicine. But that was a critical moment in her career where somebody reminded her of the more important things, the big picture. You are here to treat these people no matter what. It's not your job to judge them. I've been in the hospital enough. I know that doctors and nurses get a little judgy if they find out that, and it's not supposed to be that way, but it feels really, I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that. But we are to show mercy the way we have been shown mercy, and we are called to be merciful people, whether or not we think a person has inflicted whatever his problems are upon himself or not. When we realize how much we have been forgiven, we will delight when mercy is extended to others as well. The Christian life is not as complicated as what we often make it out to be, just like all these ideas that I was talking about earlier. Well, first of all, if you look at the law, the 613 laws and all these things, it's not as complicated as what it may seem. In Mark 12, verses 28 to 31, a man comes to Jesus and he asks him about the law and about what's important. And verse 28, Mark 12, chapter 12, verse 28, and one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, and he asked, which commandment is the most important of all? Jesus answered, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. See how easy that is? I mean, how simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. It's so simple, and yet we miss that mark. That's the big picture. Love the Lord your God. Love Him. What are you going to do if you love Him? If you love me, keep my commandments. Jesus commanded us things to do. We're supposed to love our neighbors. We're supposed to be merciful. We're supposed to be judicial in our dealings with others, so that we don't become unfair with them, or that we always treat others in an upright and fair manner. So let's stop majoring in the minors and start focusing on the important things in our walk. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Gracious Father, you've done so very much for us. Father, your mercy that you have shown us is much, much greater than anything that we are even humanly capable of or would ever be required to extend to another person. And yet, you want us to extend that to others. Oh, Father, help us as we go about our daily lives to look past the flaws of other people and of other things, and to focus on you and to serve you as you have served us. Lord, thank you so much. We can never thank you enough for being the